bit about yourself.
Where I started, where I grew up. I started out in the courts in 1970 as trial court administrator in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and was there for 6 years, and then took a job as assistant state court administrator with the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. And when the new Bankruptcy Act came in 1978, I applied for the clerkship in New Jersey, which was across the river from Philadelphia at the time, and was appointed there in 1979 and had the good fortune, I think, to serve under the Act, the old Act, the 1898 Act, and the crossover with the 1978 Act, which took effect in 1979. So I learned both sides of the bankruptcy acts at the time, and from there I spent 6 years, and then pretty much at the tail end of the Marathon case, came over to the Southern District of New York as District Court Executive.
In a quick synopsis, provide us with the history of how the bankruptcy clerk of court position was created.
It's created under the Act. The 1978 Act provided for provisions for comparable clerk's offices in the bankruptcy court with the district court in relation to the district court. That meant a clerk, courtroom deputies, the full range of activities that were going on in the district court were mimicked in the bankruptcy court under that act. Prior to that, the bankruptcy courts had what were known as chief clerks that were responsible to the bankruptcy judges, but performed their operations really under the oversight of the district court. Bankruptcy judges were appointed by the district court at that time, and the bankruptcy judges under the Act, the new Act, provided for clerks to be appointed by the bankruptcy court, as it was denominated.
What steps were taken to create the National Conference of Bankruptcy Clerks?
Well, it was a consensus at the very first meeting of bankruptcy clerks, and I can't recall where the meeting was held. It was sponsored by the FJC or the AO at the time. And at that conference, the bankruptcy clerks met separately to decide whether it was necessary to form an organization to promote their own interests, and as well as the interests of the bankruptcy courts generally. And there was a group who met in the evening, as I recall, and decided, yes, we would form an organization. And the very first event that took place during that period of time was trying to figure out who was going to be the officers of the organization. And it was somewhat of a skeleton group, skeleton organizational group, and components of that group that were formed at that time. And it was who was going to be president, and everybody sort of looked at one another and decided, well, maybe you, or it just got passed around, and finally they decided, well, whoever didn't step forward got the job, and I was the guy who was sitting on the rail at the time. And so I served for a 2-year period after that, and became the charter president of the organization. Then the bylaws were formed, and we decided to operate under a committee system that's pretty common.
Do you remember the names of who?
Well, some of the early people have since retired, but Skip Swen, who came out of the administrative office, was an attorney, I believe, in the bankruptcy division at the time. who was a clerk down in the Middle District of North Carolina, Mike Kostelchek from Baltimore, Betty Small from Milwaukee. Barbara Everly was a very active clerk before the bankruptcy code and after. And I believe Barbara was a vice chair at the time. And she had recently retired. But there was a core of bankruptcy clerks that sort of formed the charter board of directors. And, it was also an effort to mimic, in some respects, the National Conference of Bankruptcy Judges, which organization was for a long time very successful in lobbying for their own needs. And Bankruptcy Reform Act was one of those.
Do you feel that a professional organization is important to those of us in the federal court system?
Oh, absolutely. It provides a number of outlets. It provides for professional development to suit the needs of sort of the idiosyncratic needs of the group, not necessarily from a training perspective, but from a professional development perspective. It also allows the organization to promote interests, which may or may not be comparable to other organizational or institutional interests as well. I think it's extremely important. It's also important for collegial and for organizational type of methods to learn from others what you need to do to operate efficiently and effectively.
What did you all feel that was necessary to begin a new organization? Meaning, why not just continue to work under the Federal Court Clerks Association?
It's going back to that area of interest. The interest of a group may be different or supportive of the institutional interests themselves. And I think it's necessary for the groups to determine what those interests are and to go forward and promote them. Professionalism was one of them, because one of the primary purposes of the group is to raise the level of professionalism, and not only to raise the level of professionalism, but to show the other side of the court system. This was an important component of our court system, the federal court system, that you had to look to. And the people who were running this or supporting the bankruptcy court were really people who had the same interests, the same institutional interests as they did. And you saw that. The carryover of resources and the new resources, the new capital resources that became bankruptcy clerks, showed that to the judicial community as a whole. I firmly believe that.
What did you envision as the scope of this organization to be?
The scope of the National Conference of Bankruptcy Clerks to promote the professional nature of the position and the organizational components of the court itself, to deal with the changes that were taking place in the bankruptcy court system beginning in 1979, because there were a lot of changes that had taken place. There were a lot of issues that still had to be resolved with not only jurisdiction, but organizational issues too. And I keep going back to organization because I think it's important. One of the early things that had to be decided was bankruptcy clerks had to develop and implement systems that were of a comparable nature to the district courts, and they had to work alongside those courts. I mean, just the financial interests alone, working with the trustees who had worked with the bankruptcy judges, and before that the referees before, almost on a one-to-one basis. All of those things had to be implemented through the clerk's office at the time in dealing with the traditional nature of the court itself, what was going on, as well as the traditional nature of the district court, which had taken place. So those wheels within wheels that were turning had to be identified and had to be dealt with by the organization. The organization went a long way in also promoting a networking system where clerks could learn from clerks who had been there, weren't there, because a lot of people were coming in, not necessarily with their feet on the ground. I mean, they had to learn that system and learn it quickly in order to implement the ideas that were behind the legislation.
Let's talk about your term as president of NCBC, of course. What did you hope to accomplish at that time?
The major thing that I hoped to accomplish was the comparability issue, getting the court recognized, the clerk's office is recognized as an essential component of the overall judicial system. That meant we were going to have clerks that had super qualifications, that were going to be able to organize their offices, compete for scarce resources, which were extremely scarce in those days. Not that they're not scarce today, but in those days we didn't have, about half of our staff were temps, because it was new. And we were getting 3-month, 6-month, 1 year, 1 day people, and it was difficult to do it. So you had to compete for those resources, and you also had to compete for not only capital resource goods, but assets that you needed. And you had to develop your office. I mean, and saying you had to organize it was one thing, but then you had to get the resources in order to properly organize it. And when you have temporary people and you have temporary solutions to issues, or short-term solutions to long-term goals, you had to be able to resolve those types of issues.
What was the most important issues, and what were the most important issues at that time?
Well, there were a number. We were dealing with the old act, and we were dealing with the new act. We were dealing with a new act that was a 5-year pilot act with the U.S. trustee system, and we had, I think, 18 districts, 10 of which involved in 10 U.S. trustee districts, of which New York Southern and New Jersey were pilot districts. So you had a new face on the block. That new organization that the bankruptcy code created had its issues with the bankruptcy court. Because up until that time, the bankruptcy judges were handling a lot of the matters that were now in the hands of the U.S. trustee. The U.S. trustee was trying to develop their offices, organize their offices, get their resources from the Justice Department. The Justice Department was trying to organize the executive office of U.S. trustee. All of these things were going on at the same time. So you have all of these systems developing within the organization under this new act, and at the same time, You had the old act, which you were responsible for, with different chapters, some of them the same numbers, but you were dealing with somewhat complex financial situations with some of the old Chapter 10s, Chapter 11s, Chapter 12s, which turn out different. 7 business, 7 non-business. And you had all of this going on at the same time. So you were chasing the same trustee that the U.S. trustee was chasing, and what you had to do is you sort of had to mediate your roles to a large extent, that you were going to be able to deal with that trustee under the old act, and at the same time deal with that trustee maybe it was the same trustee under the new act, who had a new boss or a new oversight organization. So you were constantly going back and forth. And what was happening was, of course, that you had the demand increasing on the number of cases. And at that time, we thought, we had doubled our caseload all of a sudden under the new act, because provisions were quite clear that these were fresh starts that were coming in. And literally, people were, interpreting that as fresh start. So you had these cases coming in. Our cases were doubling, and the U.S. trustee was handling them on one side, we were handling, and they had the same problems of demand. And what was happening was they were doing the triage on their end of what was the most important type of cases they were going to look at. Well, it was obvious that they weren't able to do everything, so it sort of focused on the 11s, because now the 11s had the separate financial disclosure provisions, had the separate plan divisions, and then the controversies or the confusion of whether you had to have the disclosure statement separate from the plan, or were they to be together, who was going to decide these things, who was going to review them. See, there were all of these issues that were being resolved during this period of time, and largely they were working out. But like any workout under bankruptcy, you have the effort that's going behind that workout in order to get the conclusion that you want. Besides all of this, of course, in '82, in the middle of all of these developments, what comes along but the marathon, the Northern Pipeline case, in which the court decides that the court does not have pervasive jurisdiction. The court had to recast itself. So those types of cases, those what I term court cases, had to go to the district court, and the bankruptcy judges the bankruptcy court jurisdiction was largely unconstitutional. So what was happening was what was the position of the bankruptcy judges, and of course there was some confusion over that. They were termed consultants at the time. So the filtering aspect of that was, what was the role of other people within the bankruptcy system, namely the clerks of court. And of course, we kept operating the way we were, and it generated a great deal of angst to decide what was going to happen with the court, because those unconstitutional provisions were then delayed. The implementation of the act was delayed until Congress had time to act. Well, of course, Congress eventually did act in 1984. At the end of, incidentally, at the end of the 5-year period, by the creation of the new Bankruptcy Act, and that provision sort of outlined the appointment of bankruptcy judges, and it had also the authority to appoint a clerk of court and other officers as they approved. So that created a window under the pilot era in which there was uncertainty in an unsettling atmosphere as to what existed. And we knew what existed was the district court, and we worked within the parameters of the district court as they provided us with, assistance. So I was, actually taking the cases that we were the orders and everything to a bankruptcy judge or a district judge to have the order signed, because the question about whether bankruptcy judges could actually sign an order.
Interesting. Do you recall how big the NCBC organization was at that time?
I think most of the members, most of the clerks were members of the organization. They ultimately came. There were a few people, I recall a few people, and I won't name names, who decided not to join because it was more important to join other organizations, which they were very active in. And it was sort of localized conditions. But for the most part, I believe that almost all 94 at the time, with a few exceptions, opted not to join.
So am I correct into assuming that most members were clerk of courts? Were there any non-clerk of courts?
No, not at that time.
Not at that time.
Not at that time. They were all clerks.
What were your hopes and goals for the future of NCBC?
Well, my goals for the organization was simply very simply to get organized. Number one, to find out what our role was with the NCBC, NCBJ, NCBC, because the NCBJ bankruptcy judges were somewhat effective organization. I don't want to modify that by the word somewhat, because they didn't get everything they were looking for, but they got a lot legislatively and policy decisions. And I think the other major issue was to get recognition that we were a professional group of people. We were meaningful to the federal judiciary, and we were going to fulfill a role regardless of what you thought. We were going to comply with the law and the spirit of that law, and we were going to also make sure that the bankruptcy judges were fully supported in everything we did. And if we had to, reorganize staff to provide those comparable organizational positions that we needed to do, like a courtroom space son, rather innocent today or simple, but with courtroom deputies or docket clerks or whatever we had to do in order to make that system work with permanent and temporary people, we did. And we were also, I think, far ahead in some respects in automation at the time. And bankruptcy was the perfect spot, as you know personally from ECF, because way back when there were two tracks going on at the same time with claims, especially with claims. One was the ban system, bankruptcy noticing system, which was developed by EPI, which had a really neat component to the claims processing, which was a docketing system that was turned over to the AO. And the other track was really a claims system in which you could buy a lumber down here on Walker or White Street, I don't remember, but they're still around. You could buy the form, and if you had the right font, by using their forms, you could scan at that time and automatically record claims. It was a tough sell. The ban system was not as much of a tough sell as the other system, but both both were, available at the time, and that's going back to band started in '79. The district was using Fortran, which was basically an indexing system. And our operator is smiling back there because he remembers Fortran. But basically, that was it. And when trial courts, at least in Philadelphia, had automated their criminal system back in the '60s. And a large number of trial courts back then were beginning to automate early '70s with civil, criminal, and jury management systems. So bankruptcy was following on the heels of all of this, interestingly enough.
Do you think NCBC is meeting the expectations the founders had in mind?
Oh, I think so. I don't think there's any question about that. You'd see the independence that exists out there. I think that bankruptcy courts have come a long way in solidifying their role in the federal judiciary as a essential component. I'm sitting here as a district court appointee, and I look on the bankruptcy court here, or what I see in other areas, as a separate entity. Yet I know legally a unit of the district court, but that operates fine. I mean, it carries out their responsibilities in a very professional and outstanding manner, and has a great reputation. The judges, the staff, they're terrific. So, we don't control whatever they do, and if anybody around here that's looking to run down there or over there or up there to make things work better, I think that there's a good management system in place, and I think that's the key to make it operate. To have people look at you as a model. Where did all the ECFs start? It started in bankruptcy. Where did some other innovations start? In bankruptcy, because it's a place where you can test systems. I think that's a good place, and I also think it's a perfect place to do those things. Make sure that they operate properly there before we undertake to implement them ourselves. It may be a little bit more complex here, but I don't know that the paper is any different than it is there.
Well, I have one last question, and a very important one.
Yes, sir.
Are you an NCBC member?
No, I'm not an NCBC.
You're not an NCBC.
Never.
Well, you know what? I'm sure there'll be an application in the mail directed to you pretty soon.
Will there be an enrollment fee?
Well, of course. We'll take care of it now. Cliff, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Glad to talk to you.
A little bit about the history and the creation of the bankruptcy clerks of court.
The bankruptcy clerks were established under the 1978 Act, which created a pilot court system, a 5-year pilot. And as part of the Act, there was a separate clerk of court post that was created that was comparable to the clerk of the district court. And so there was a period there after the 78 Act was created, in which there was this reorganization of both the bankruptcy courts as they existed prior to 79, as well as the district courts in some respects, because there was a separation of responsibilities that was created.
Who were the people who formed the National Conference of Bankruptcy Clerks?
It was formed after a session that the bankruptcy clerks participated in, I believe in Delaware, at a conference sponsored by the AO. in the bankruptcy division at the time. There was no bankruptcy clerk's office as we know it. Everything was handled for the bankruptcy clerks by the bankruptcy division. And the motivator or the coordinator of a lot of these activities was Kent Presson, who was the deputy in the office at the time, what I would characterize as a chief deputy, who was very active in promoting educational and mentoring programs for bankruptcy offices generally before the act came into effect, and then thereafter.
Do you feel that the professional organization is important and necessary for those of us in the federal systems, federal court systems?
Oh, it was for the bankruptcy clerks because it was a new adventure. And there were a lot of things going on in 79 and 80 that demanded an organization that would promote the interests of bankruptcy clerks, bankruptcy offices, as well as the bankruptcy judges. There was a parallel group of bankruptcy judges, a bankruptcy conference of judges, and so what we tried to do was to establish a bankruptcy clerks conference to not only support the bankruptcy judges conference, but also to promote the interests of bankruptcy clerks generally. There was, this sense of professionalism that was developed. There was the pilot program that was going on in 18 districts, one of which was New Jersey, where I was at, and a relationship between the bankruptcy judges at the time and U.S. trustee within the 10 of 18 districts, and just sorting out responsibilities that had to be created, and also the organization itself of bankruptcy clerks and where their interests were going at the time. So it was a lot of work, a lot of sifting of responsibilities and understanding of clerks' offices, clerks themselves, networking, getting to know new people. Some people had been in the system, some clerks had been in the system for a long time, others were coming in. And there was, a melding sort of bankruptcy institutional knowledges at the time for the new people such as myself who came out of the state court system, understanding what was going on.
But you all felt it was necessary to start a new organization rather than continue with the Federal Courts Clerks Association.
Oh yeah, the Federal Court Clerks Association had much broader mission, and the bankruptcy clerks were focused on what they had to do at the time, how they were going to organize and how they were going to create. One of the things was you have a new office and new responsibilities. You have financial responsibilities. You have, you had the old trustee system operating at the same time under the 38 Act and even the 1898 Act. Some districts had floating around. So there was, a cross-reference that was going on here where the clerk's office had responsibilities for the administration of previous estates, and now you had the new estates coming into effect, the new code coming into effect, without Chapter 10s at the time and without Chapter 12s at the time. So you had sevens. It was pretty cut. To me, it was pretty clearly cut. You had the 7s, the 11s, and the 13s, and you had to deal with those cases that were hanging out there, 7s, 11s, and 13s, and 10s, which we had in Jersey, that were being administered actually in other courts, such as the Delaware Chancery Court. So you had all of these wheels within wheels gyrating and new responsibilities, and at the same time you were working with it. In our instance, the district clerk, to sort of separate some of the duties which they had undertaken and you were undertaking for them. And there were other issues, staffing issues, which were a big problem because in the early 80s, bankruptcy clerks' offices were getting temps. And they were getting these 3 months, 6 months, 10-month, year temps. And recruitment was difficult. And at the same time, you had caseload going up, not like you have now. I mean, we thought we had this, huge caseload from 3,200 to 6,000 cases at the time, which pales in comparison to what's going on today. But we did have some, a fairly large number of 11s cases that were going through, and some interesting type of business 7s that were also going through the court. And so the focus of the bankruptcy clerks at the time were on really what your needs were and what resources you were going to get and how you were going to use them in order to properly, administer and support the court. And it was a struggle. It was a real struggle. And of course, those days too, you didn't have decentralization, which you have now, and everything you needed. Pens, pencil, you went to the AO on AO 19s, I think they were AO 19s at the time, and it was a Mother May I type of operation, and 6 months later you get a confirmed receipt back from the AO, yes, you can go and get that pen for Judge X, Y, and Z. So it was an interesting time of life, and it really taxed a lot of the efforts that were going on.
Could imagine. What steps were taken to create the creation of NCBC actually? Meaning, like, how was it set up? Did you have a constitution? Did you have bylaws, committees?
We did. We had what we did was after one of the meetings at Delaware. We all got together separate and apart from the sponsors of the meeting, the AO and the bankruptcy division, and decided, what we were going to do as a group without the AO. Not that we weren't going to cooperate with the AO, but we were trying to figure out where we were heading at the time, and that's what sparked the creation. The Bankruptcy Judges Conference was a very effective organization, as you might expect from the Act, and then carried over to the 1984 Act. They had a very effective lobbying group in Washington, a lobbyist, not a lobbying group. And of course, we were looking at all of these features and what our needs were going to be and trying to understand the implications of the Act itself as it related to bankruptcy law and bankruptcy administration. So what we did was, create this organization, and as I mentioned to you, who was going to lead this organization, and I must have been sort of asleep at the time, or not paying much attention when everybody sort of stepped backwards and said, who's going to do this and who's going to do that, and finally accepted the post as the charter president of the organization. And what we did then is decide, how are we going to organize this? And it was a fairly big group at the time too. I mean, there was a lot of interest in this operation, and so what we did was, we knew we needed to have a charter. We needed to know, what our focus was going to be in terms of what the mission of this organization was going to be, and that was, largely support from the AO, with the AO, to the AO, with the bankruptcy judges themselves, and some also, relationship with the district clerks, because that was important at the time. We were, the bankruptcy judges and offices were being spun off for for management purposes to the bankruptcy courts at the time. So there had to be an understanding, because there was bankruptcy judges before that were supported by the district clerk, and other types of resources that were got. So where were we going at the time? So bylaws, sort of an organizational committee meeting, a networking committee had to be established, and we did that at that point of time, and subsequently, sort of sifted out what our other needs were going to be. But it was just generally trying to get a hold on where this whole thing was going to head, and get a good grip and focus on where this organization was going to.
At the time, what did you envision the scope of the organization would be? What was its mission?
Well, the mission was, I think, twofold. The mission was to, of course, design an organization that would be supportive of the clerks. I mean, that may sound kind of very general and generic, but it was simply, how we were going to help ourselves achieve the needs and understandings that had to be established. And the second thing was we had to work closely with the bankruptcy judges, supporting them and getting their support, to move ahead and to find out, what their feelings were, what their needs were, how they viewed this new system, and how we were going to support them as well, and understand where they're coming from, and understanding their roles, what they visioned this. And of course, that 78 Act created not only the trustee system, which created sort of an underlying, I characterize this as an underlying, sort of underlying understanding doesn't seem to follow correctly, but of what you're going to do in relationship to the trustees, to that trustee group that's out there, in relation to a new type of administration, which was going to really supervise what was going on. So you had the bankruptcy judges responsible for one act of administration, and then you had the clerks responsible for another act. You also had the clerks, closing cases, and closing an 11 and an old 11 and a 10 were very difficult at the time. So, we had to learn a lot of things, and with the assistance of the bankruptcy judges, and vice versa, and with the existing staff that you had going into these offices. There weren't wholesale, dismissals and disgorgements and everything else. It was, an attempt to understand what was going on. And then, out of all of this activity that was going on, you had a transition that was being supported by a group of bankruptcy judges, as well as others within the administrative office, to understand where the organization and administration and management, largely, of the bankruptcy courts are going to be after 1984. So 1984 being not what it was 1984. And there was a lot of activity in terms of studying by the Transition Advisory Group as to where this whole thing was heading, and where it headed after 1984. All right, in the midst of all of this comes Marathon. Northern Pipeline and Marathon erupts. So then the bankruptcy clerks take on a new role, and a much more serious role, in my view, because that left bankruptcy judges in sort of a jurisdictional limbo as far as pervasive jurisdiction is concerned, and the district court picking up cases, picking up administration of bankruptcy Act's cases. And, you had both the Act and the Code cases there, and then you had the AO and the judiciary in general trying to figure out what are bankruptcy judges, and what type of jurisdiction they had. So we were named consultants at the time, and as a result of that, the bankruptcy clerk and bankruptcy officers took on new responsibilities vis-a-vis trustees, vis-a-vis the district judges, the district clerk, and staff as well. And as well as the administrative office, trying to wade through what I call Marathon 1 and Marathon 2, which sort of, led us into that 94 or 84 Act. So within the offices themselves, I'm speaking, in particular here, there was a confusion that had to be settled. And we didn't know where anything was going at the time, quite frankly, except what you had to do is, show a great deal of leadership qualities in terms of settling your offices down in order to get the work done. That's basically it. Get the cases, moving, keep them solved, and establishing good relationships with trustees, bankruptcy judges, the AO, and everybody else who was a part of this long explanation about everything. But there was a hell of a lot going on at the time.
Let's talk about your term as president.
It was great.
What did you hope to accomplish during your term?
Well, I hope to, set a focus as to what the conference was going to be about. Keep abreast of legislation, and we had a guy that came in and did a great job, Howard Beck, in establishing a relationship with the Congress through a congressman in Roanoke, Virginia, I think, who was in the same federal building as Howard was at the time, as well as others, in the office, and also trying to establish this relationship with the conference itself and the transition team. So it was multiple, in addition to the bylaws, and the other committee work that had to be done, personnel and things like that. The focus was really simply getting the conference organized, setting a mission statement, which I believe is pretty consistent right now to what it was in 1980, and simply settling into an organization that was going to promote the needs of bankruptcy clerks. And I think, I'm not patting myself on the back, but subsequent administrations became very successful in doing that.
What would you say was the most important issue?
Recognition of the clerk and the clerk's offices. I think that was one of the things that we tried to establish from the get-go. That was a tough road because of established institutional conditions at the time. I mean, you have a district clerk's office that was established in 1789, and you have a brand new kid on the block suddenly taking over a separate type of organization which mimics yours. So what's going on here?
What did you and the board do to address any other issues that you could that were very important at the time?
I think it was establishing this relationship with the bankruptcy division and the relationship with individuals within the division, which became very important. Education programs, for example, trying to garner some support from not only the AO in terms of education and training programs, but also from the FJC. And the FJC was, and the AO for that matter, was very helpful in doing that. And it did, it was networking, establishing relationships, getting programs together, and understanding finance in many respects, because the money was collected by someone else, a district at the time, and here you are, taking money across the counter, which became a no-no. It's suddenly in 1980 you're doing something you need to secure more firmly, and that meant operational aspects of this whole thing and redesign of offices and training of personnel and setting up personnel plans, grading systems, taking people out of the office and making them courtroom deputies or electronic recording operators, things like that. I mean, these little, you don't think of them in general, but these little things that we needed to understand had to be developed, and it took some time to do that.
At the time, what were your hopes and the goals of the conference? Where do you think it was going to head?
I thought that it was going to be very successful because of the group that I saw before me. Quite honestly, people were serious about undertaking these responsibilities. There was a sense of professionalism, a sense that that we're going to make this work. There was also a sense that I think that the judges had a new sense of importance, if that helped their egos, and a new source of importance from both Congress and from the administration as well. And that, I think, I didn't have any doubt that was going to happen. You had some of the finest judges in the country at the time. I mean, that was a credit to the district courts. I mean, the district courts picked some of the best people, and I think that was, helpful in establishing this professional relationship.
To the extent that you keep in touch with members of the conference now, do you know where the conference is in relation to where it first started? What is your opinion of where it is now?
I think it's a self-sustaining professional organization that appears to be following the goals that were established in 1980, and that's a credit to everyone. The whole lineage of successors to making it work. I mean, after 30 years, for God's sakes, I think that bankruptcy clerks ought to be proud of the operation that they have, and what our relationship is. So, and I think that's a great relationship all over the country. And you know what? Times change, and there's new understandings of what are going, and quite frankly, things are more complex in all courts today. And you see it here in New York with the establishment of what we call innovative courts. But bankruptcy has established itself as a freestanding, very important institution in society. I don't have to tell you about Lehman Brothers and all the other things that are going on, the Madoff cases and things like that, or that are here. And, I'm sure they're everywhere else too, in commodities cases that go through these courts, and they affect people's lives, not in property, but the lives of people themselves. So I think that, it's here. And, where it goes from here depends on what you guys do.
But as one of the founders of the organization, do you think that it has kept its goals since inception?
Yes.
Well, Cliff, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.